Hello, welcome to Unofficial Partner, the sports business podcast. I'm Richard Gillis. Today's guest is Dame Tracey Crouch.
It's easy, right? I mean, I've made my peace with the fact that for everything that goes wrong now in football, it's going to be my fault. I've come to terms with that. And again, there are a lot of men out there in football who don't like the fact that a woman looked into football and came up with this conclusion.
Crouch is a Conservative Party politician who served as an MP for Chatham and Aylesford from 2010 to 2024. She was appointed as Minister for Sport, Civil Society and Loneliness in 2017, but resigned in 2018 due to a delay over the introduction of reduced limits on stakes of fixed odds betting terminals. In April 2021, Crouch was appointed to chair a review of English football following the Super League controversy, with a remit to look at the game's long-standing concerns about club ownership and financial sustainability in the English game. Following the review in November 21, a final report made 10 strategic recommendations for the future of football clubs. The main one was the establishment through legislation of an independent regulator for English football, IREF. The IREF would, among other things, oversee the financial regulation of the game and establish new owners and directors' tests for clubs. The report also said that women's football should be treated with parity and have its own dedicated review. She is a qualified FA football coach and manages a youth girls football team and is a keen Spurs fan. She didn't stand in the 2024 general election, just gone past, and is now managing director of sport at Hanover Communications. We recorded the following conversation the day after the budget last week. Unofficial Partner is the leading podcast for the sports business, and there's a newsletter that is read by tens of thousands of people across the business of sport. If you want to receive that every Thursday morning in your inbox, go to unofficialpartner.com and sign up there. I was thinking about you yesterday, and I was wondering what it's like the day after a budget. When you're Minister for Sport, what happens? Is it a thick of it type thing? Is everyone running around in absolute panic, or is it all planned and do you know what you're going to be doing that day?
There's a bit of a combination of both, to be honest with you. Not quite the thick of it, but there's definitely a sort of, there's pre-meetings. You kind of know what's going to be in there for you. Your civil servants have probably seen the final wording that's going into the red book or the green book if it's a pre-budget. And you've probably spoken to your stakeholders. And so it's sort of it is all organised. There is less chaos to it than perhaps looks like on the TV. But ultimately, there will be some people that are disappointed by any budget. And some of those might be your stakeholders if you're a minister. And you have to try and manage that at the same time.
So who are the stakeholders that you're talking about in sport? What would they be? I mean, my head goes in certain directions, but what would be in your mind?
Well, anyone who's funded by government, so any of the arm's length bodies such as UK Sport, Sport England, Sports Ground Safety Authority, that sort of stuff. But then within that, also their NGBs, potentially any kind of funding partner like the Football Foundation, for example, or anyone that has received a chunk of money for a particular project or scheme. So, if you happen to be a sport that particular Prime Minister likes at the time and that particular Prime Minister has committed a certain amount of funding to a particular project, then obviously the budget is a good opportunity to announce that. But then it's also a good opportunity to take it away if prime ministers have changed in between. So there'd be that. And then also there'll be things that you don't even appreciate are related to sport, but are a consequence. Business rates, for example, or plant and machinery, tax reliefs, all those sorts of things that really do have an impact. Then there'll be schemes within schemes. So if you're in the NHS and you're participating in some coordinated scheme with a health service provider to provide physical activity, then you have an interest in that budget. If you're in the Home Office supporting them in perhaps a knife or a gang crime initiative, then likewise you'll be interested in their budgets. So, there's a lot of different areas of sport that something as simple as a budget statement will touch.
So, I mean, it's fascinating because I'm wondering, is that before the budget? Do you know the consequences of it? Have you done the modelling of what that, the various strands of that before, or is it a post-budget thing?
Well, it can be both. So if it comes with a spending review, departmental spending round, then, that some of those negotiations and discussions happen over a significant amount of time. And what will happen is that the budget or whatever, the financial statement will announce the headline figure, and then you have to then drill down into the detail with your stakeholders on those things. So it's a lot of work goes into these financial statements behind the scenes, and then Chancellor stands up and really all the public care about is the price of petrol or a pint of beer. But ultimately, at the end of the day, there's significant consequences. You take something like Department of Education. A lot of people who listen to this podcast will be interested in school PE. Well, PE doesn't fit within the sports minister's brief. It sits into the Department of Education brief. And therefore, you automatically look at perhaps a departmental budget cut and you think, oh, how does this impact PE? And you're actually looking at the wrong department's budget. And so, some of those initiatives are funded completely separately. So it's a bit of a minefield in terms of how you navigate your way around the funding projects for sports. But ultimately, that's what the civil servants and ministers are there to help with.
What was your reading of yesterday?
From a sports perspective, neutral, actually. I mean, it was fantastic that UK Sport finally got their settlement for the LA Olympics. I've sort of kind of shared their frustration behind the scenes as to how long it has taken government to announce that. It is a complex issue, but certainly when I was sports minister, we were heading into Rio, and I made absolutely certain that the then Chancellor, George Osborne, had signed off our budget for Tokyo before, the opening ceremony of Rio, because I was told that basically the Olympics is effectively a giant jobs fair for performance directors and behind the scenes talent. So you want to give the security of budget for our elite performances elite sports, so that when they are at the games, they're focusing solely on their outputs. And then likewise, Paris was signed off really early in the Olympic cycle, so that, again, people were very minded to just concentrate on what was happening in Tokyo. So it's a bit of a frustration that LA, which is actually going to be a really expensive Olympic Games, just in terms of the nuts and bolts, and mind, everything else behind it, but it needed to have that extra funding for UK sport. And it's just been, I think, a bit of a nightmare for them to get that.
Why is it more expensive? So what are the nuts and bolts?
Logistics in terms of the provision and new sports that are currently not potentially funded sports, so things like that.
The jobs fair thing, that's really interesting. I find this world really interesting. So do you mean that the worry is that the people that UK sport employ will go and get jobs, or is it a place that everyone is going to go and recruit for the next cycle?
Well, it's not for me. It's not for me to shine a spotlight on that. I'm not in that world. It was an interesting phrase that was said to me about the need for having that early funding. But, you have, if you think about it, all these excellent performance directors, you have all the best nutritionists, the scientists, the coaches, the people behind, the athletes, all in one place at one particular time. And if your funding is not set for the next funding round, but another country comes up to you and says, but ours is, come and join us, ultimately in the day, these people are highly, brilliant, impressive coaches, directors, what have you, they have careers. So making sure that they have that security is an extremely important part of what sports, what the NGBs, what the UK sport does.
You say that there's been a tussle, or the UK sport, you shared their frustrations. Is there an argument against them within? Is that what the problem is? Is that there's a lobby against them getting the money?
No.
Or is it just that it's just not a priority and people's heads aren't in the space?
I think the challenge has always been, and certainly the challenge was there when I was minister, and I doubt it's changed, is that government has a 3-year spending cycle. Olympic sports have a 4-year one. So I think it's just as simple as trying to tally up the spending rounds. It shouldn't be something that sends everybody into a tailspin, but it does. And sometimes let's remember, not everybody loves sport the way that we do, yeah. And not everyone understands the business of sport or the value of sport or the community assets that sport brings. And so quite often have a skewed view and will just look at a spreadsheet of the figures as opposed to the outputs of the investment.
What's the arguments or the lobby against sport? Because one of the questions I've got, we're sort of looking at some of these questions, and I think it starts with the premise of why it's so hard to do something good. That's a sort of idea that you quite often hear, that when sports argument makes its way through government, it seems oddly difficult to get things done. Now you're out of it. Do you know why? I'm just wondering if there is an idea that actually, no, that this doesn't work, that the Olympics, we're not going to pay for the UK sport because we've lost the medals inspiration argument filtering down to grassroots. That doesn't work anymore. I can see an argument there. I'm just wondering if that's ever articulated or it's just in the machinery of government that goes astray.
So I think fundamentally, people within Westminster wholly understand the importance and value of sport. And I think that most people recognise that we do have to invest in certainly our Olympic athletes, because would you want to be the Chancellor or the Prime Minister that didn't make that investment, that then subsequently led to the loss of our prominent position in the medals table? And would you then want to be the person that then gets blamed for, years of decline in inspiration or aspiration of young athletes?
Well, I think there is an argument. I've heard that made that we've diverted money upwards rather than downwards, and we've put money into the performance industry, has benefited hugely since the sort of as the lottery money's come in.
Good. I think that's a good thing. I think it's a good thing that we're at the cutting edge of performance, and I think we've maintained our position in the medal table in Olympics, Paralympics, Winter Olympics. Okay, maybe not Winter Olympics, but I think that we are, we punch above our weight in many respects in some of these things, and I think that's a good thing, and I think we do inspire through the Olympics for a whole variety of reasons. The next generation. And I think you look at some of the stories that were told post-Paris of people who as kids had gone, seen London 2012 and wanted to be a freestyle diver or a gymnast or whatever, the sorts of sports that don't get blanket coverage on TV or in our newspapers, so as you do rely on the Olympic cycle, and you rely on the broadcast of that Olympic cycle, and you rely on the investment in those Olympic sports in order to get people into those positions. I mean, I would have loved to have been able to be in a position to have invested more money in 50-meter swimming pools. And in fact, actually, one of the things that we were working on a lot was how can we get a 50-meter swimming pool in every single county, because we don't have that at the moment, to get more people into competitive swimming. Because actually, I think there is a view, and I share that view, that if we become the dominant force in swimming, then we will be even higher up that medal table. We really do start to take on the Americans, really challenge them properly. So, I actually, you're not going to get me, you're certainly never going to see me say we should have less investment in sport, and particularly elite sport. And I do think that that does, in a way, filter down into the grassroots, but it can always be done more, it can be done better. And the challenge is, how do you get that across to your colleagues in the Treasury? And that's the real nub of it, really.
I think that obviously the conversation around London 2012 and the legacy, I don't want to get into that, but the argument was that George Osborne, you mentioned him earlier, essentially hobbled it before it got going, and that he took the money out, the investment, under the banner of austerity, and any participation legacy of London 2012 was never going to work.
Well, we were quite lucky in sport in the department in that actually we managed to maintain a fairly good settlement. And actually, I don't think sport forgot that. And certainly, I remember the sports being quite grateful because there were other budgets that were absolutely massacred as a result of that austerity drive. I do think that we need to think about legacy in a much wider sense for London 2012. I mean, I look at East London in a very different way to pre-2012. And I think some of the facilities that benefited from the London Olympics and so on. It's not perfect. And actually, part of the sports strategy that I published in 2015 was to restart that legacy programme. And again, that's recently been refreshed. And I suspect the new government will have another look at that and see how we can drive further legacy from it. But I don't think we have anything to be ashamed of in terms of London 2012. I think that you can look at other Olympic venues or host cities and see a very different story. And I think on the whole, with the combination of the investment that Boris and then Sadiq Khan have put in terms of London, the redevelopment, the east end of London, the new facilities, the interest in different sports that don't, as I say, have that TV coverage, I think we should be proud of that legacy.
When you look at the governing bodies, the NGB model, and we've organised in vertical funding a pyramid, is it the best compromise that people love to knock the NGBs and they moan about various things about them, but is it essentially you wouldn't change that structure given a clean piece of paper? I know you never get a clean piece of paper, but sometimes people say, oh, well, if the objective is a healthier nation, then you're putting incentives in to conflict against each other and they'll compete against each other for funding, and that's not what we want as a society, etc. So I'm just wondering, but actually I've just had this conversation about paddle and pickleball and the LTA. They're trying to sort of, there's a bun fight there, and you land on, okay, well, it's just about incentives. The LTA has seen the new thing and wants to wrap its arm around it. But is it basically that structure is the right one with a few tweaks, or do you think there'll be a fundamentally different approach, or is there one that you would have liked to have got to?
So I think NGBs are important, and I think that we need to remember that many are armed with governance structures that are filled by volunteers, and I think we should all be grateful for that, actually.
Absolutely.
I do think that you could have efficiencies within the overall structure of NGBs. So you need to have NGBs because that's how they're part of their international federations and so on, right? Yeah. So they need to exist. But you don't necessarily need to have 14 finance directors or, every single NGB having a lawyer or an HR function. You can combine some of those into perhaps blocks of sports, urban sports being a really easy one to try and sort of kind of put together. But, that is for them to work out. And I think if it's the argument has to be that is about allowing for greater investment into the sport rather than it be about efficiency savings. Because I think if you can prove that this isn't just about the Treasury taking away money, but actually it's about taking that money and making it work smarter and getting it into the facilities, or getting it into the investment in coaches, or in increasing active participation, then I think you're going to have a much better outcome than we need to save X million pounds from the overall budget.
Obviously, this is a business of sport conversation or a podcast. Quite often people land on pooling or aggregation of various things. So it could be, you're talking about there on the supply side, the services side. It's almost like the sort of local council. I was a teacher 25 years ago, and they took the accounts department and the payroll and all that, and the local council, and then devolved it into the schools. And then so every school had their own thing. It feels like these things come in cycles, that then the devolved structure looks extravagant, and then you go back to a more centralized thing. And then around the place, there's people saying, well, we should pull audience data, we should pull ticketing, we should pull sort of media sales, all of this stuff. Do you think that that's where it's going? It feels like there's a shift that way.
Yeah, I mean, you quite often hear people in business saying, work smart, not hard type thing.
Yeah,
And
I
maybe,
don't know what that means.
No, nor do I. I'm not smart enough, which is why I work so hard. But no, I do think that there is probably some merit in the argument. How you apply it into sport remains to be seen. And I think that people do have certain requirements from their international kind of federations as to what it is that they have within their governing bodies. And so it's how do you make sure you're honouring that whilst also trying to drive those efficiencies, get more money into the sport itself. And certainly I hear what you say from a school's perspective, having devolved all that power back to schools, that we then went through the academy kind of structures, which then effectively did exactly the same thing, which pulled them, and I always kind of used to think of it more like the stationery cupboard,
Yeah.
you have one supplier for all the paper clips across 6 schools rather than having 6 schools with their own suppliers of paper clips. Sport is a very complex ecosystem, and part of that complexity is why it works, why we are successful. We can always do things better. And I think even the best businesses in whatever sector recognise that they can always drive those efficiencies. The marginal gains, as somebody once famously said.
Whatever happened to him? It's very alluring. It's like when people talk about, so my wife is an NHS midwife, and periodically they go through what if they just had 5 drugs, or what if every police car was from one supplier? The buying power on the side of the government, if that was coordinated, you get to a position where I think, oh yeah, I can buy into that. I'm starting to, feel that. Is that just a utopian dream that people that you could have that control over the marketplace?
I think it just has to be really properly stress tested. I mean, taking it out of sort of kind of NHS or education, I remember there were reforms in the fire service where they suddenly cut the number of firemen by personnel in each response unit by 1. And then what happened is that they then had to send 2 response units to cover the same fire. And so it's like trying to make sure that you do get that efficiency without actually breaking the system. So I just think that these things, there's always talk about it. At some point, somebody has to do something about it. We don't have this finite sort of pool of money that can be put into sport, regardless of the sport. And I just think that if we want to have a really diverse, grassroots and professional sporting environment, then we have to think smart about how we continue to do that in the future. Because, there are only so many, there's only so much money in TV rights deals. There's only so many people that are willing to sponsor. There's only so much government can plug into it. So ultimately, at the end of the day, there is something that just has to be worked through by sports themselves.
What were you surprised about? There's a lobbying question, I think, in terms of, because again, sport, as Sport Inc., however you define it, a sort of abstract noun. And sometimes people say, oh, we're not very good at lobbying government.
Okay.
Are those people idiots, or are they, is that just, what's it like being on that side when you are
being lobbied?
Because you've got the various interests being lobbied.
Well, it depends what they're lobbying for. I think it depends what they're lobbying for. I think actually sometimes sport is very good at lobbying for what it wants, what it needs. And other times what it wants or what it needs is just not achievable. So I think it's about basically having the right strategy in place. And I'm now in a world where I can help people with that, FYI.
Yeah, there you go. See how it works.
Yeah, do feel free to get in touch. But I wouldn't say sport was unsuccessful on how it's lobbying. I think it depends on what it's lobbying for. So if we dare to just tippy-toe into football regulator for a second, the Premier League lobbying to try and stop it was perhaps misguided because it was a ball of snow that was not going to stop rolling. And so its lobbying strategy, one might suggest, was not right.
How does it just on that though? So how do they do it? They just so you have a meeting one day and someone from the Premier League turns up, or an agency, or someone representing them? Is that how it works, or is it a dinner, or what? Just because obviously lobbying is one of those words that people just jump on and
just throw out there as a sort of kind
suspect
of,
Machiavellian sort of things going on.
It can be done in all sorts of ways. And actually, there's nothing wrong with lobbying, by the way. And I think that it's really important for industry to talk to government, to talk to civil servants, because some of the issues are really complex. So before I became an MP, I worked for Aviva, the insurance company, and some of the issues that we were lobbying government on were really technical issues. Some people are listening to this podcast might understand the ins and outs of a with profits pension policy and how the long-term smoothing processes of it, but actually
noise I'm hearing now.
People have
barely make out. It's like your dog whistling.
People have just switched off. But
pension smoothing.
But
there's a whole series in that.
As it happens, the vast majority of politicians would not know about that. And likewise, it is very easy to have a view about football. It's very easy to have perhaps a prejudiced view based on your own experience of your like or your dislike of the sport, or where your club is at a particular point in the table and all that sort of stuff. But actually,
we're both Spurs fans, Tracey, bear in mind.
Therefore, eternal pessimists. But the truth is that there is more complexity to the sport than what happens, for 90 minutes. Now, everyone listening to this podcast will know and appreciate that, but politicians don't. And in fact, many politicians don't like sport. They don't understand sport. They understand the importance and the value of sport in their communities, but they won't understand the business aspects of sport. They certainly won't have any idea of the regulatory aspects of sport, whether that is, who the regulator is, be that football, rugby, international, sports. They won't get where it gets its money from. So they won't understand TV rights deals. They won't understand commercial sponsorship and things like that. So it's really important for sport to lobby MPs and government and civil servants for them to know that. Otherwise, politicians just go around in blissful ignorance until they're told. And that's because politicians tend to be sort of kind of, I guess, dealing with 100 different issues all the time. And I think that's why it is essential that when there are really important things that are coming up, that people are sat down with whoever it is, the sport themselves or advisors. Normally, it's better to have the sport themselves there to explain some of those issues.
The football regulator, there's lots of interesting bits to it, obviously, but your place in this I find really fascinating, because it's not normally what your lot want to do. They don't want to regulate. They want to let the market free. That's the whole point. And there's two questions. One, the question is, did you get any sort of philosophical pushback from your own party about the government meddling in football?
Only those that didn't understand the debate, to be honest with you. So It's quite easy to say, we have an ideological opposition to regulation, until you ask them, well, do you have an ideological, opposition to the city being regulated, or to water companies, or to electricity companies, or whatever? And actually,
they do, don't they, most of the time?
Well, no, not when their constituents lost, millions of pounds in the banking crisis, or whatever. So actually, I think it's people not necessarily understanding the whole point of the debate. But the fact is that there is also a bit of hypocrisy in that when a football club goes bust in their own constituency, or a grassroots club disappears, or what have you, that they go to the minister saying something must be done, right? You need to stop this from happening. And so there's always a desire for intervention when it happens right on your doorstep, and then this ideological opposition to it from a from a sort of kind of macro perspective. And I think genuinely the people that are saying this are people who have no idea about the long-term aspects of the debate.
What was your main concern? What was driving your passion for this?
Well, I didn't start off with a passion for it in the sense that it was just something that evolved over time. Although I've been accused of having a starting position of being pro-regulator, actually what I had a starting position for was that something had to be done. And over time, it became quite clear that that thing had to be something different to the system that is now. And that came out of some of the stories that we were hearing from clubs and also fans, where there had been issues that had come up where none of the what would have been seen as the regulator or the authority in charge could deal with. They would quite often get pushed from pillar to post, and clubs would come in and say, well, we raised this with, for example, the EFL, and the EFL said, go to the FA, and the FA would say, but it's nothing to do with us, go to the EFL. And then, they were just going around in this kind of circle. And that's kind of what happened with Bury as well, in many respects. Or certainly that was the experience that the club representatives gave us. And you just ended up feeling that people just didn't know where to go. And if there was an issue, and that the authorities themselves hadn't really made it clear who was the authority on particular issues. And so as time went on and as the argument evolved and the problems became a bit more obvious, the regulator was the outcome. And certainly, again, when we started off, there wasn't necessarily a universal agreement on the review team, on the panel, that there should. And then there were certain points of evidence sessions that really convinced people that we needed needed a regulator. So the argument definitely evolved over time, but I think once we were all on the same page, that's when it really, all the nuts and bolts and details sort of kind of started to write themselves.
What do you make about the arguments that you're hobbling the Premier League and it's one of the great success stories that is based on money and investment, and it's never been a fair, finance doesn't play fair, and there has to be that model in place?
I think it's a bit of a lazy argument, to be honest with you, because actually we made it very clear that when we were going through the consideration process, we set out very clearly that we didn't want to do anything that damaged international competitiveness. We didn't want to do anything that damaged the reputation of the Premier League in terms of its global export value. And it wasn't going to stop, broadcasting deals. It wasn't going to stop talent coming in. It wasn't going to stop people wanting to watch the Premier League. So it doesn't interfere with clubs in terms of attracting fans and all that sort of stuff. So I just think it's just a bit of a lazy kind of reaction, really. The Premier League had the opportunity to get involved, embrace and shape the fan ad review, and they took the decision not to do that. So prior to to it all kicking off, there were certainly suggestions that whatever we came up with could help with owners and directors tests, that could help with the real-time financial monitoring of clubs, could help with improving governance and everything else. So as you can imagine, it was a bit of a surprise when we got to the end of that to discover that all of the positive early suggestions from the Premier League were not something that they then welcomed. But I personally think that they've got their comms wrong on this, and I think that they could have had the bill done and dusted now, and they could be focusing on other more pressing matters. But they chose to try and stop the bill from progressing through Parliament under the last government, and now it's arguably a lot tougher with the new bill having been strengthened. So it's an interesting outcome, really.
It's interesting you sort of frame it as an issue of comms. Do you think that actually it's more about they don't have control of the clubs? That it's more substantive than this is a comms position?
Actually, I'd say they do have control of the clubs on this particular issue, because many of the clubs we spoke to all the clubs as well, Premier League. or most of the clubs, I should say, in the Premier League. And many of the clubs privately told us that they supported the idea of an independent regulator. And of course, none of those clubs have actually come out and said that. So I would argue that the Premier League has a really good grip of its stakeholders, because they've all maintained their silence and stayed within the wider positioning of the Premier League.
And the argument that you've laid the conditions for Super League Mark II, I know it came from, the Super League was the sort of traumatic moment that was part of its genesis. But what do you think about that argument, that actually what you've done is encouraged or laid the conditions for the incentives for clubs to break away again?
I haven't heard that argument, so that's a new one on me.
Really?
Yeah. I've not heard that argument. I mean, it was the Premier League that came and asked government to intervene on the Super League. Let's always remember that. And so, which is why I always found the argument that government should be intervening in football from the Premier League a really interesting one, when they actually asked the Prime Minister to stop this from happening. Hence Boris's famous legislative bomb, or whatever he said, as a consequence. But no, I've not heard this. We're going to this is going to cause the next Super League argument before. I'm not sure it will, by the way. I'm not quite sure how that would be the case.
Whether it happens or not, I suppose they might blame this. That would be that's a separate
and it's easy
issue.
It's easy, right? I mean, I've made my peace with the fact that, for everything that goes wrong now in football, it's going to be my fault. I've come to terms with that. And, and again, there are a lot of men out there in football who don't like the fact that a woman looked into football and came up with this conclusion. And I've come to terms with that as well. I've made peace with the fact that there is misogyny in football, that one very senior person in football referred to the Football Review as a vanity project for the girl, in a public forum, by the way.
Wow.
And so, and I've come to terms with all of that. It's like, literally, if anything happens, it will be my fault. If a club goes bust, right, for whatever reason, and by the way, the football regulator is not there to stop clubs from going bust. It's not there to stop failure. It's there to try and prevent it as much as possible. But if it happens, if the worst case scenario happens, it's going to be my fault. If there is ever a deal done by the Premier League and the EFL on redistribution and it doesn't work, it will be my fault. I've completely, this is just as it is, because football never looks at itself and comes to the conclusion that it could have done it better. It will always blame someone else for its failings. And I'm just going to be that person for the rest of my life.
That's incredible to think you've come to that position.
It's a sad position to come to, right? And let's be clear, and I may be sort of kind of laughing off and shrugging it off, but the truth is that, when I was thinking about what the rest of my life would look like, I had always assumed that football would play an absolute fundamental part in post-parliamentary life. This was before I took the decision to leave Parliament myself. I just always assumed that at some point in my future I would leave Parliament. I was never going to be a lifer in Parliament. And I always thought football would be a fundamental part of that exit strategy. And now that's not the case. And yet it is the sport that, is probably the one I love the most. I still play it. I still watch it. I still give a Premier League club my money, both in season tickets and in merchandise and things like that. So, but, it's just a sad reality that I'm not welcome in football anymore. And, and that is, I do get upset about it. I'd be lying if I said I didn't, but that's the outcome, right?
Well, it's fascinating. What, in terms of the job itself, what do you think the person who gets the job needs to make that successful?
So I really hope that the person that they recruit to be the chair, and I think, by the way, there's a difference between the chair and the chief executive. I think they need to have a financial background. I think that they need to have an understanding of some of the really detailed issues around capital and liquidity and, sort of solvency. But they also need to have a really good understanding of football, its uniqueness, that you can't switch a football club, that the owners are custodians, that it's a completely unique kind of consumer relationship, if you like. It is an odd business, and I think they have to understand that. But I think, certainly for the chief executive, and I mean this kindly, I don't mean it in a derogatory way, I just hope they're really boring, right? I actually don't want to see or hear from either the chief exec or the chair of the football regulator. I don't want them to be personalities. I don't want them to be politicians, but with a small p. I mean, they're going to have to be diplomats. They're going to have to navigate their way through a minefield of, different interested parties, but they just have to get on with the job. And that they also have to have their eye on the ball the whole time, because there will be very smart lawyers out there looking for every single opportunity to try and do the regulator down. It's like, again, I think there are a lot of people in football who are wishing the regulator to fail. And so they're going to have to be a pretty tough person, whoever it is.
I mean, they call the England manager job impossible, but blimey, that's, it's, so they need power, but they're a technocrat. They need to keep their head down, but it's going to be one of the most high profile positions in the game.
Yeah,
it's going to be back page of the Daily Mail stuff, isn't it?
Yeah, also, I think it's really difficult, because if they're seen in any kind of football environment, there's going to be questions about whether or not they're being lobbied in one particular way or another. So actually, if you're a die-hard season ticket holder at whatever club, you either have to accept that if you're going to be the regulator, you can no longer go and watch your club play football, or if you do, you're going to have to recognise that someone's going to criticise that, and potentially try and make it that this is somehow going to sway your views on things. So it's really challenging. But there are people out there that can do this. Not me. I have no interest.
Well, that was the question, but I know I've talked to you in the past, and you sort of laughed when I've asked you that question. So
no, actually, the reason why I just think it would look really contrived, right? I think it would look like I'd come along, been asked to look at the future of football, come up with the idea of football regulator, and then become the regulator. It would just look like I'd created my own career path. And so, no, that's part of the reason.
Fascinating. Right. The women's game and the WSL and the growth of that. We've just come off the back of a Sky announcement and the media rights. And give me a sort of perspective on, it's not so much a regulator question, but it's just the sort of its relationship to the politics of football. Because again, there are various lobbies, again, wanting to stand aside, be completely separate. And then there's others that say, no, it's got to benefit from as part of the men's game. And where do you sit? Because it's a difficult balance sometimes, arguments, I think.
It's really difficult. And actually, I can see both sides of the argument. But what we decided in the football review was for there to be a separate review into the game, because we were receiving evidence, which again was mixed. There was no single kind of, position of travel on it. Some people were given evidence saying that women's clubs need to completely disassociate themselves with men's clubs and sort of kind of plough their own furrow and get the sponsorship and start again. And even though that would be two steps back in the future, it would really make sure it's very different. And then there were others that saying, no, we absolutely have to remain within the wider ecosystem so that we can continue to drive that investment, have that coordinated approach to things. So that's why we decided to separate it from the football review and make the football review solely focused on the men's game. And in part because actually that's where the sustainability issue was really focused, and it was the men's game that effectively triggered the football review, the demise of Berry, the Super League, big picture, all that sort of stuff. And so that's why we chose our focus. Karen Carney did her excellent review, and there have been many recommendations that have come out of that. The legislation that is being set up for the football regulator, it can, in the future, bring the women's game into the scope of the regulator. It's not closed to women's football in the future. But there is an argument, and I think it's probably one that is stronger at the moment, that actually women's football is not yet in the place to be in that scope of the regulator. Does it want to be in the scope of the regulator with all of the significant sort of kind of challenges and pressures that would put on the women's game? So, I think that I'm watching with interest how the women's game is going to evolve. I think it's really interesting, and it's creating great opportunities for the sport. It's really important that the sport also doesn't make the same mistakes as the men's game by chasing success through huge investment into talent that is not sustainable, that sort of stuff. It's got to be something that happens over time, so that it doesn't end up in a very similar situation to what's happened in the men's game. I want to see the end result as much as anyone. I can't wait to see women's football on the same sort of kind of level as men's football, getting, proper competitive prices and structures and everything else. But ultimately, we're not there yet. And I think, it needs to evolve over time to get that.
Does it need to be closed off for a period of time? What do you think about that?
What do you mean by closed off?
An American style league. We talk about Super League, but there is and I'm going to say that in its period now, to protect it or to grow it or to create the environment which we all want, the trajectory of it to fulfill its potential, etc., that actually removing promotion relegation for a period of time, they'd be able to sort of encourage investment, get stadia built quicker, get money in because you're securing the investment in the same way as the NFL or the NBA does and the American model. Instinctively, I'm hating that. When people are presenting the argument to me, I think, okay, I can see I don't even know if it's possible for a shorter period of time to do it. And I know this will really annoy the people at WSL. And I know that Maggie Murphy runs our, with Matt Cutler, who does our expected goals, our business of women's football podcast, will hate this. She always tells me to shut up when I start talking about it. But there's a bit of me that wonders actually that might be advantageous for it in a short period of time.
Well, I'm not going to go up against Maggie, to be honest with you.
No, I wouldn't either. I wouldn't.
I think the thing is that in sport is a weird thing, right? Because you can make the intellectual case for it, but ultimately, in the day, how often are we driven by the intellectual argument versus, how much more powerful is the heart argument? And ultimately, at the end of the day, it's just not our style. We're not America. How very dare you even suggest that we ought to be? But we're not America. We understand the importance and value of competition with all that brings, and it's really important. And when I'm trying to teach my son the value of losing as much as winning, and yet he sees no consequence of it from a sport where there is no relegation, then how does that tally? So, I kind of sit there and I think, I understand why we need to get more investment into the game, but is the right way forward to effectively completely alter the competitive aspect of football? So I'm with Maggie on this.
Yeah. Well, that's not a bad shout, when in doubt. There's a betting question I had, because I've just come back from Monaco and Sportel, and that's where obviously, as the TV sports industry meets, and betting is sort of off stage slightly. And because it's euphemized as engagement and whatever. And I just wonder, given your background and your stance on it, what you think in terms of the relationship between, it could be just as simple as, the sponsorship of shirts in the Premier League being too high. There's that argument. But then that's not what it's all about, because as you know, it's much more about closer convergence of the betting industry into media. And actually, we're not far off betting companies and in various parts of Europe and the world they are bidding for rights. And so essentially you're getting a complete convergence of media and gambling companies. Just share what your position on it now, because obviously your sort of stance against betting, but just in general.
I mean, first of all, I didn't have a stance against betting. I took a stance against fixed odd betting terminals, which is the casino content machines that are in bookmakers on your high streets that could effectively take £100 from you in 20 seconds. So, that was the policy. I'm not anti-betting. I gamble myself, not often, but I will go and put money on Spurs or an international match or tournaments.
Would that be defined as a mug punter? People put money on Spurs.
I could possibly comment. But so I bet. I'm not anti gambling. What I do worry about is the sort of kind of it's creep. It's unseen influence, the sort of kind of everywhere sort of aspect of gambling. And I think the challenge is that it's probably too late to do anything about it in many respects. There are things that you can do to tame it slightly, but I think the beast is already out in the wild, and I just don't think that it's ever going to change. And I know I've spoken to chief execs of football clubs before, and I've sort of kind of almost begged them to not put gambling adverts on sleeves or on their hoardings around pitches. And we're talking at lower league football here, not sort of kind of Premier League. And they will say to you in a quite a pained response, I would love to not have gambling adverts. They may well even then tell you a story about somebody in their life who has succumbed to a gambling addiction. But they will also tell you that they pay more than anybody else. And ultimately, at the end of the day, when I'm sitting here trying to say we have to make football clubs as sustainable as possible, you can't then argue that they can't take the biggest source of their revenue. Now, you can argue, is that right? And people will have different views on that. But ultimately, that's the business world that they now operate in. I think some of the changes that we did make when I was minister was that sort of kind of highly pressurized betting aspect, bet now kind of thing, where you suddenly felt that if you didn't put your bet on that particular odd right now, you were going to lose out instantly, and then you lost anyway. That we changed some of that, but people like a bet on their football team. They like to know, who's going to be the biggest, is going to get the golden boot at the end of a tournament, that sort of stuff.
I mean, I sort of revealed my age and lack of sophistication when I start talking about convergence of television. Actually, what we're talking about is the relationship between this conversation and sort of iPhone addiction and social media addiction in terms of the scroll and the way in which gaming is being sort of put at the center of the experience. And I think, as you say, it's out there and the beast is out there. And actually, it's a question far beyond a sports minister's brief or even, I don't know how individual governments do much about that, because you're fighting the biggest companies in the world there.
It's philosophical. It's a philosophical debate in many respects. I mean, I think it is everywhere, right? And leagues are sponsored by betting companies. Podcasts are sponsored by betting companies. It's and it's a much bigger part of our life than when we were growing up, right? It's a much bigger part of our life where the only bet that you could place in a bookmakers was on a horse race, and that has changed. Now, there are arguments as to whether or not, therefore, we should be doing different things, such as perhaps having a sports betting levy, so that every bet takes, a certain percentage of that money is taken and it's reinvested back into sport. But then there are arguments about which sport gets the money and so on. So there are different aspects to the debate, and it's just not as simple. And I used to say, and it was painful to say this, but to the families of addicts that I met who their loved ones had taken their own lives because of a gambling habit, and they were questioning why we couldn't instantly stop TV gambling adverts, and particularly those that bookend sports. and to sort of kind of talk through the complexity of that investment in that sport being on TV from a gambling company and how that then goes back into the sport. It's a really hard conversation to have, because people do get themselves into difficult situations with gambling, but it is everywhere. And it's everywhere.
It is,
and I feel very sorry for those who do suffer from that.
Absolutely. And there's a sense that sometimes I'm a big fan of the Premier League, for example, put that as the caveat. But if it had behaved in the last 20 years in the same way as the IOC has behaved, and again, I'm happy to criticize the IOC for various things, but that would have played a more positive role in this issue. I think there's a sort of, one of the legacies of the Premier League is the normalization of betting at scale. If you were picking a marketing platform on which to build over the last 20, 25 years, you wouldn't go too far wrong with creating the Premier League.
I think the thing is as well, the gaming aspect that you talk about is a real challenge for individual clubs, because what they're getting is they're getting people coming in and they're harvesting the data that's being sent back to real-time, betting companies in China or wherever. And then so actually there are all sorts of different challenges that are coming from gambling. It's not just for those that are watching it, but those that are also involved in the business of it, where their data is effectively being stolen by people that are involved in the wider global industry.
No, I completely agree with that, but that's a sort of separate problem. I mean, it is a problem, it's a big problem, but it's a different problem. And
it's about money, though. It's about money, right?
Yeah.
And that's so it's sort of the same problem, which is that gambling is now a sort of kind of a global issue, and football, the sport of football, is almost very central to that, because people are betting on the sport itself.
If a regulator were to say, right, if the regulator had the power to stop that or to make that sort of statement, there would be a completely different perception of it in the marketplace, wouldn't it? That person who's coming in as the regulator doesn't have that sort of power to do anything about this issue, do they?
No, they don't. The football regulator is not dealing with gambling. The Gambling Commission is there to talk about gambling, and the Gambling Commission can look at these things from a harmful gambling perspective. And if it were to have a view that football is in and of itself sort of kind of contributing significantly to gambling harm, then that may have an issue. Also, the Gambling Commission is in charge of the integrity of betting. And so if there are scandals, as we know that there are, of gambling or some kind of betting issues in sport, then that's the regulator for that. That's not for the football regulator is there to make sure that the long-term sustainability of football clubs is looked after.
Okay. Right, just to finish off, what's it like on the outside? You've got your posh new office at Hanover. How has that transition been? Is there anything sort of surprised and delighted you?
Oh, I'm like in the happiest place I've been for such a long time. I'm really, really enjoying life outside. People keep asking me if I miss it, and the answer is no. And I sort of
you make it sound like a prison, though, don't you? Life outside.
Life outside. Well, it is an institution. So in all seriousness, it is an institution, and it is something, I talk about being reintegrated back into society. So, you are in a very different world when you're in Westminster. I mean, I've kind of fallen back in love with London because I've spent 14 years just in Westminster and in a very small part of Westminster. And now I'm walking around, Borough Market and along the South Bank, and it's just completely different. And so I'm very much enjoying it. I'm always one to try with self-improvement, so I'm learning new things all the time. I've got a young but very experienced and engaged team who are teaching me about Gen Z influencers that I've never heard of. I'm making a fool of myself on a regular occasion. Like, they were talking about somebody called George Clark, and I was like, are you talking about the man who did the stuff on sheds? And they were like, no. So he's apparently a really famous Gen Z influencer. So, I'm really enjoying it. And there's pressure, but it's a different type of pressure. I'm busy, but it's a different busy. And so, yeah, it's good. It's good. And I'm, bringing in new clients and engaging, with new sports. So it's fun.
It's funny, as you describe that world, though, the Westminster world, you sort of think, it's really weird to want to go. Well, do normal people end up there, and do they thrive in that environment? And I'm defining you as a normal person, and that is a compliment.
Well, they do, right? And actually, people do thrive. And don't get me wrong, I had 14 wonderful years. I have some very fond memories. I achieved some good things in my time, but it was time to move on. I don't look back with a sense of regret about things, and I'm very happy doing what I'm doing at Hanover. But normal people can and should go into Parliament, because actually, if normal people don't go into Parliament, then you end up with a whole bunch of people who perhaps shouldn't be running the country being in Parliament. So, we have to have people going in with a set of diverse backgrounds. And some of my best friends in Parliament came from, not just, by the way, my own party, people across the House, bus drivers or brickies or carpenters or teachers or nurses. These are all ordinary people with ordinary lives and ordinary families. And, so I think it's essential that we still encourage people to go into Parliament. It's just, I've done my time.
On the outside.
Well, I think it's like school, right? When you get to the end of your A levels, you're done with education. You're finished. You're ready to move on. And that's how I felt. I'd done 14 years. I had learned everything that I was going to learn. I achieved everything I wanted to achieve. And it was time to move on and be reintegrated back into society.
Brilliant. Okay. Well, listen, and good luck with the new thing. And thanks for coming on. Really appreciate it.
You're very welcome.